Vectorworks has several different types of light sources, and they can interact in different ways depending on the situation. I'm going to go over some of the basics, and then we'll continue working with the lighting sources in different situations in the rest of the projects this semester. To start, I'm going to turn on a new palette, the Visualization palette. The Visualization palette will list all of the lights in your document, and you can control the lights, turning them on and off, and using other controls of the lights through the Visualization palette. You'll see that to start with, we have no lights in this document. You can, however, still see the model. I talked about this in an earlier video, but if there are no lights in a document, Vectorworks uses what I like to call a fake light source that provides very basic illumination so that you can see the model. It's not uncommon to want to model without light sources and then add the lights in at the end. So if you don't have light sources, there is this sort of built-in fake light source, which is similar to, but not exactly the same thing as, an ambient light source, which we'll talk about later. The fake light source is only functional when there are no lights in the document. If you add a light to the document, even if it's turned off, the fake light source goes away. Let me show you that. So if we add a light, and turn it off and go back to our view, you'll see that everything is dark. So even though the light is turned off, Vectorworks knows that there's a light in the document and assumes that if you put a light in the document, even if you have it off, you intend for it to be off, so it leaves everything black. If we turn that light on, then we start to see the effect of the light. It has shadows, etc. So this is the first type of light, the type of light that we've been using in the first couple of projects. This is the directional light, which basically simulates a sun. The thing to know about the directional light is the placement in the document doesn't really matter. So if you take a look at how these objects are lit and where the shadows are, then if we move the light source, so now it's in a completely different place than it was before, but the lights are exactly the same. I can move it up, I can move it down, I can move it left, and I can move it right. Where you actually place this particular source doesn't make any difference. The only thing that makes a difference is the control of the azimuth and the elevation. This is because it's simulating a sun, and it's as with the sun, the rays are parallel, so it doesn't make any difference where they're emanating from. It's basically a sheet of light coming from these two directions. The couple of things with this that you can control are, of course, whether it's on or off, and you can control that in Object Info or in the Visualization palette. You can control whether the light casts shadows or not. You can control whether the shadows are soft. You're not going to see a whole lot of difference here in OpenGL. You can see a little bit of difference, but if you're in one of the RenderWorks modes, you can tell the difference between soft shadows and hard shadows. You can control the brightness of the light. This is basically a dimmer. So you can go from 0 to full. And actually, unlike in real life, you can go above full. If you want to put it at 1,000, you can, which sometimes is helpful. It often washes things out, but just be aware that you're not constrained by actual reality or physics inside the program. And you can control the color. So you can make the light whatever color you want. And of course, as I already said, you can control the azimuth, which is basically the pan of the light, and the elevation, which is the tilt. I'm going to put this back to white. Even though there's a light source, this image is still rather dark. It's dark overall, and it's particularly dark in the shadows. That's because there is only light coming from one direction. In reality, there is always some light, at least, coming from other directions besides just the main source. This is called ambient light, just sort of general light that's around. In the case of the sun, the ambient light is created by the sky and the atmosphere itself. So in Vectorworks, you can access adjust the ambient light by going to the View palette, View, Set Lighting Options, and you can turn on or off ambient light, and you'll see that this has an immediate effect. So it brightens up the overall image, but it also fills in light in the shadows, and you can adjust the intensity of the ambient light. You also can adjust the color of it. So if you're trying to simulate sunlight, for example, the ambient light may in fact be a light blue because it's being reflected from the sky. But I usually leave this set at white. We're going to turn our directional light off and insert a different type of light. This time we're going to insert a spotlight, which, as the name would imply, acts similar to a theater spotlight. So I'm going to go to Top View, and I'm going to insert this light, point it in that direction. And unlike the directional light, the spotlights actually are dependent on where they are and where they're focused. So in order to ascertain that, I'm going to go to Front View, and you'll notice the light disappears. That's because in the template, there's a setting in Vectorworks Preferences where the lighting objects are set to only show up in wireframe. And the template is also set to automatically go to OpenGL when you go to any of the non-top views. So I'm going to change this to wireframe so you can actually see that light. And then I'm going to just move it up here. Spotlights have to be focused. So in order to do that, you can grab them by the blue box there and point that at the place where you would like to focus the light. So that if we look at this in OpenGL, you'll see the effect. So that looks like a spotlight. The rays of the light are not parallel because the shadows get bigger as they get farther away from the object. Unlike the directional light, which doesn't look that different when you're in rendering modes other than OpenGL, the spotlight usually does. So let's take a look at this in RenderWorks. And you'll see there's a substantial difference there. It gets brighter. The other thing to bear in mind with OpenGL rendering is OpenGL only supports 9 light sources. So if you have more than 9 light sources, it ignores those above 9. And it seems to be very random about which 9 it chooses. It doesn't necessarily always pick the first 9 that you put in the document. I haven't ever been able to figure out exactly how it decides which 9 lights to use, but just be aware that in OpenGL it only uses 9 light sources. So back to the spotlight mode for a moment. There are a couple of things that you can adjust with Spotlight. You can adjust there are 2 angles here, the spread and the beam. The spread is basically the size of the cone of light. So this is set at 60 degrees now. If I set this to 90 degrees, you'll see that the light just gets bigger. If I set it to 40 degrees, it will get smaller. And you'll notice that also becomes a little more sharply focused. That's basically what the beam, at least in Vectorworks, does for us. If the beam and the spread are the same, then the light is sharply focused. As the beam gets smaller than the spread, the light gets more diffused. And you'll notice it also gets somewhat dimmer. Usually the default here is that the beam is set at half of the spread. I'm not actually sure what happens if you make it larger. I think it just, it upped the spread too. So interesting to know. You can't make the beam larger than the spread. If you make the beam larger than the spread, it will just increase the spread. So I'm going to put this back to the default at 60 and 30. You have pan and control capability. After you've done the initial focus, actually I guess even if you don't do an initial focus, you have the ability to pan and tilt the lights. You can adjust the color. I'll put this back to white. You can adjust the distance fall off. This is also a control in the third type of lighting. We're going to look at the point source, and it's easier to see with the point source, so I'm going to show it to you in point source, but just be aware that you can adjust the distance fall off with the spotlight. Let's go back and see if there are any other. I think that's all of the. You can set it to cast shadows. Whoa, you can set it to cast shadows or not. OpenGL. So we can turn the shadows off. You can set it to cast soft shadows. We will talk about lit fog later when we talk about the other type of lighting. There's this sort of built-in Vectorworks lighting, and then there's also lighting that simulates real theatrical instruments, which we're going to talk about in a later project. And when we get to the later project, we'll talk about the lit fog option. But for now, just be aware that it is an option. And of course, as with all lights, the last control is brightness. You have control of the brightness with the slider here, and of course you can turn it up above 100 if you have a reason to do that. So we're going to turn this light off, and we're going to go to the third light source, which is the point light, or they usually call it a point source. They call it a point light. In order to do that, I'm going to go to a different model here. We're going to look at the an interior. There we go. Okay, so this is a room. I'm going to go to top view here, and I'm going to insert a point light, which is, as the picture would imply, basically it's like a bare bulb. So I'm going to put this here in the middle of the room. I'm just going to leave all of the defaults the same. I'm going to switch to a side view because it will have put it on the ground. And then I'm just going to move that up so it's somewhere in the center, and then go back here. And you'll notice immediately in OpenGL that the room has gotten much brighter. Let's see what this looks like in a RenderWorks mode. Okay, so this is the point source. It simulates a bare bulb. You have some of the same controls that you do with the other lights. You can control the brightness. You can control whether it casts shadows or not, soft shadows. You'll notice that you don't have any positioning or angle control. It's purely based on where you put it, just like a real light bulb would be. It's wherever you put the bulb, that's where the light comes from. So there's no angle control. I do want to look at the distance fall off, which, if you remember, I just said is also available with the spotlight type. Basically, the way real lights in the real world work are the farther away you are from the light, the dimmer the light is. In the distance fall off, you can set that to not react to reality. So this is set to none. So this means that basically wherever we are in the room, that light is going to be the same brightness, which is sometimes useful, but is not realistic. We can set this to realistic, and you'll see there's almost no light. Okay, now you'll see that in realistic mode, there's a little bit of light coming out of around the bulb, but not very much. If you're familiar with physics, the way light works in the real world is not only does it get dimmer the farther away you get from the light, but it uses what's called the inverse square law. So if you're 2 feet away from the light, it's 4 times dimmer than it would be at 1 foot away from the light. So it falls off really fast the farther you get away from the light. Sometimes this is useful, But for me, usually the mode that is the most useful is sort of a compromise. So there's this mode, which there's no fall off. Interesting what happened to the floor there. There's the realistic mode where there's drastic fall off, and then Vectorworks has sort of a intermediate mode where there's smooth fall off. And what that does is it does a linear fall off rather than an inverse square fall off. So 2 feet away, it's only 2 times dimmer, not 4 times dimmer. So that is the point source. The point source will let me show you a couple of other things. It's because it's easy to see and point source. And the first of those is indirect lighting. So this is a white room. What this in OpenGL is not taking into account is that the light would be hitting the walls and reflecting or bouncing off the walls, and so this scene would actually be brighter than it is. So if we go back to the lighting options and turn indirect lighting on, you will see that it makes absolutely no difference because we're in OpenGL. If you're in any of the rendering modes, so let me turn that off. So no bounce. Okay, so if we go to a RenderWorks mode, it looks like this. Then if we turn the indirect lighting on and give it a minute, now you'll notice it's a whole lot brighter because it's taking into account the light bouncing around the room. The other thing that's available to us in the lighting options is something that's called ambient occlusion. And if you take a look at this view with ambient occlusion turned off, then if I turn ambient occlusion on, what it does is darken in corners. So if you take a look in the room that you're in right now, unless it's extremely brightly lit, you should notice that the corners, so the corners of the walls, where the walls meet the ceiling, where the walls meet the floor, are going to be slightly darker. Now, it's a little bit exaggerated in this example, but this can sometimes be really helpful in defining forms. So just be aware that ambient occlusion is a thing. You can change it to be less. Whoops. Strong, basically. So that looks a little, looks a little, I keep moving the mouse and it keeps re-rendering. That looks a little more realistic. You should also be aware that the rendering modes, so for instance, whiteout, which is what I created for our projects, can have their own lighting, and lighting in rendering modes overrules the general lighting. I'm not even sure. Let's see what happens. I don't know what will happen if we put this in whiteout. Yeah, it didn't change a lot. Basically, what the whiteout renderer does is it has a white, basically, atmosphere surrounding the world, and it uses that to create an overall white light source. You can see it outside the window here. Just be aware that rendering modes have their own lighting controls, and the lighting set in a rendering mode can interact with and sometimes even overrule the lighting that you've set in the document globally.